Eddie was the kind of man who carried silence in his eyes. You know the type, the ones who walk into a room and somehow make less noise than the shadows themselves. He wasn't always like that, or at least that's what the fragments of his past suggest. But by the time you would have met him, if you had, the spark was already dimmed, the fight already leaving his bones. He lived like a ghost long before he ever became one. His story is not unique, and maybe that's the tragedy of it, because there are millions of people like Eddie, people who quietly give up on life long before anyone notices. They fade not with a dramatic collapse, but with a slow, quiet erosion of hope. And if you look closely, you might even recognize pieces of yourself in him. Eddie grew up in a small town, tucked somewhere between quiet roads and factory smoke. His father worked double shifts. His mother tried to keep the family together with tired hands and a strained smile. There wasn't much tenderness in his house, but there wasn't much cruelty either. Just the cold indifference of survival. That's the first thing you learn in stories like Eddie's. Sometimes it's not the storms that break people. It's the constant drizzle, the unrelenting grayness of an ordinary struggle. As a boy, Eddie used to dream. He dreamed of being an artist, of filling sketchbooks with worlds no one had ever seen. But his drawings, taped to the refrigerator with cheap magnets, were always treated as childish distractions. "That's nice," his parents would say, but never more than that. Praise was rationed like bread in his house. And slowly, almost invisibly, he started believing what the world suggested, that his passions were not practical, that his worth was measured only in what he could endure, not what he could create. By the time he was a teenager, those sketchbooks had disappeared, replaced by long hours working part-time jobs. Statistics show that young people who are forced to take on adult responsibilities too early often experience higher levels of stress, depression, and burnout later in life. Eddie was a living proof of that. His childhood ended not with a bang, but with a timecard punched into a machine. Still, he tried. He kept pushing forward. That's another important detail. People like Eddie don't give up all at once. They give up gradually, first on small things, then on medium things, and eventually on the big ones. Eddie gave up on his dream of college, then on friendships that required too much effort, then on love, because why risk heartbreak when numbness was easier? Every surrender made the next one simpler. By his 20s, Eddie was surviving but not living. He woke up, went to work, came home, scrolled through his phone, and slept. Day after day, year after year. The algorithm served him an endless rotation of distractions, funny clips, tragic news, fleeting pleasures, and slowly his nervous system adapted to this new kind of fragmented reality, where emotions were scattered like puzzle pieces that never formed a whole. He wasn't alone in this. Studies from the last 2 decades show a sharp rise in anxiety and depression, particularly among young adults, coinciding with the rise of social media and overstimulation. Eddie wasn't defective. He was reacting exactly the way a human being reacts when submerged in chaos. But here's the thing, when you're in the middle of it, it never feels systemic. It feels personal. Eddie thought his numbness was his fault. His inability to feel joy, his lack of motivation, his endless fatigue. He believed these were signs of some fundamental flaw inside him. And so Eddie gave up, not in one dramatic moment, but in 1,000 tiny choices. He stopped returning calls from old friends. He stopped cooking real meals. He stopped cleaning his apartment until dishes piled like monuments to neglect. And eventually, he stopped looking in the mirror because he couldn't stand the eyes that stared back. Now, if you were to meet Eddie then, you might not have noticed. He still smiled politely at work. He still nodded along in conversations. He still said, "I'm fine," when asked how he was doing. Because giving up doesn't always look like falling apart. Sometimes it looks like functioning. Sometimes it looks like a person who is quietly erasing themselves while still wearing the mask of normalcy. And here's the brutal truth. Society rarely notices people like Eddie until it's too late. We live in a world that rewards productivity, not presence. As long as Eddie showed up to work, paid his bills, and stayed out of trouble. No one asked if he was okay. And when they did, they wanted the short answer, not the real one. That's one of the cruelties of modern life. We are surrounded by people, but many of us are deeply alone. But let's pause here. Let's step back from Eddie's personal story and look at the bigger picture. Because Eddie's life, as heartbreaking as it is not just the story of one man. It's the story of a culture that quietly teaches people to give up. Consider this. Research from the World Health Organization shows that depression is now the leading cause of disability worldwide. Over 300 million people are affected. Anxiety disorders follow closely behind. These aren't just statistics, they are reflections of millions of lives like Eddie's, lives where hope slowly withers under the weight of pressure, disconnection, and relentless expectations. And yet, most solutions offered are directed inward. Fix yourself, heal yourself, optimize yourself. Take a pill, download an app, read a book, do some breathing exercises. And while those tools can help, they also reinforce a dangerous idea that the problem is solely you, that your sadness is a malfunction instead of what it really is, a very human response to an overwhelming reality. Eddie never learned that. He thought he was broken, and because he believed he was broken, he never asked for help. He never told anyone the full depth of his despair. He just faded. But what if we looked at Eddie's life differently? What if instead of seeing him as a man who failed to cope, we saw him as a mirror reflecting back the cracks in our systems, our communities, our culture? Maybe Eddie wasn't weak. Maybe he was just unbearably human in a world that keeps demanding we act like machines. And this is where the lesson begins to unfold. Giving up on life is rarely about laziness or weakness. More often, it's about exhaustion. It's about people who carry more than they can possibly hold until their spirit quietly fractures under the weight. So, let's return to Eddie, sitting in his dimly lit apartment, scrolling endlessly on his phone. Imagine him pausing for a moment, staring at the glow of the screen, reflecting on his tired face. Deep down, a small whisper tells him that something is terribly off, that this can't be all there is, but the whisper is faint, drowned out by the noise of distraction. And Eddie, like so many of us, keeps scrolling. The question is, how many Eddies are out there right now? How many people are quietly giving up, thinking it's their fault, when really it's the inevitable result of an overstimulated, disconnected, and profit-driven world? That's the tragedy, but it's also the beginning of something else. Because once you see it, once you understand that Eddie's story is not a personal failing, but a collective one, you can never unsee it. You begin to ask new questions, you begin to look for real answers, and maybe, just maybe, you begin to realize that Eddie's story is not just his, it's ours. Eddie's story doesn't end in that apartment, at least not yet, because when someone gives up on life, the story isn't really about the final collapse, it's about what happens in the silence before it. That silence is where the deepest lessons hide. You see, when Eddie sat there night after night staring at the ceiling, it wasn't that he wanted to stop existing. What he really wanted was for the pain to stop existing, and that distinction matters, because research shows that the vast majority of people who feel like giving up don't actually want to end their lives. They want to end their suffering. They want a way out of the endless loop of exhaustion, emptiness, and quiet despair. Eddie's suffering was born from two things: disconnection from himself and disconnection from others. He had forgotten who he once was, that little boy with the sketchbooks, and he had no one in his life reminding him of it. Psychologists often describe this as loss of coherence. When your life story no longer feels like it makes sense, when the past and the present don't connect to a meaningful future, the human mind begins to shut down. That's what was happening to Eddie. But here's the twist. Eddie wasn't weak for feeling this way. He was deeply human. In fact, some of the greatest thinkers in history have gone through similar moments of despair. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard once described despair as the sickness unto death, not because it literally kills you, but because it suffocates your spirit. And yet, he also argued that despair can become the starting point of transformation, because it forces you to confront the truth of your existence. So maybe Eddie's silence wasn't just emptiness, Maybe it was the ground clearing before something new could be built. Let's imagine Eddie one morning. He wakes up same as always, but something small shifts. Maybe it's the way sunlight cuts through his blinds differently. Maybe it's a random memory of his old drawings. Maybe it's just the exhaustion of being exhausted. Whatever it is, he feels a faint pull, a reminder that life wasn't always this grey. And here's the part we often miss. Recovery doesn't begin with a miracle. It begins with a whisper. For Eddie, that whisper was the realization that he didn't actually want to disappear. He wanted to feel alive again. This is where the educational side of his story matters. Studies in psychology show that one of the most powerful antidotes to despair is connection. Not necessarily therapy, not necessarily medication, though those can help, but simple human connection. Talking to someone, being seen by someone, being reminded that you are not invisible. It's astonishing how many people report that the single moment that saved them was a conversation, a hug, or even a stranger's kindness. So let's imagine Eddie reaching out, hesitantly, awkwardly, to an old friend. Maybe he just says, "Hey, do you want to grab coffee?" That moment, small as it seems, is rebellion. It is him choosing, however shakily, to step back toward life. And once again, research confirms this. The smallest acts of reaching out often break the cycle of isolation and spark a slow upward spiral. But the deeper lesson here is not just about Eddie, it's about us, because Eddie could be anyone, your neighbor, your coworker, the stranger you passed on the bus, and sometimes Eddie could even be you, which is why his story forces us to ask how many people around us are quietly fading while we remain too distracted to notice. Modern culture doesn't make this easy. We live in a world that constantly tells us to be self-sufficient, to handle our problems privately, to curate an image of strength. But human beings were never meant to carry their burdens alone. Anthropologists argue that for most of history, survival itself depended on deep community bonds. To be isolated back then was to die. Today, isolation kills in a slower way. It eats away at our spirit. And yet, the path back is still the same. Community, connection, shared humanity. Eddie's brutal past, then, is not just a warning. It's a teaching. It shows us what happens when someone is stripped of meaning, connection, and self-worth. But it also shows us where the doorway back can be found. Because even in the darkest silence, the faintest memory of love, creativity, or connection can begin to pull someone toward the light. This is where philosophy meets psychology. Nietzsche once said, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." Eddie's problem was not just the weight of his struggles, it was the absence of a why. He had lost the thread of meaning in his own story. But meaning isn't something you stumble across, it's something you build, and that realization can change everything. So let's imagine Eddie again, months later. He's still scarred, still tired, but something has shifted. He starts sketching again, not for approval, not for profit, but because it reminds him of who he is. He starts meeting with that friend more often, even if just for coffee and silence. He starts taking small walks outside, just to feel the wind on his face. These things don't fix everything, but they begin to weave coherence back into his life. And here's the truth. Eddie's story is still hard. There's no fairy tale transformation. Life doesn't suddenly stop being difficult. But he learned something vital, that giving up wasn't really about weakness. It was about being disconnected. And reconnection, while fragile, is always possible. If you take nothing else from Eddie's life, take this. Despair is not the end. It is a signal that something in your life has gone deeply out of balance. And if you can listen to that signal, if you can resist blaming yourself and instead seek connection and meaning, you can begin to step back into life. Right now, as you listen, maybe you recognize some of Eddie's silence in yourself. Maybe you felt that same weight, that same temptation to fade. If that's true, let this story remind you, you are not broken, you are not defective, you are human. And being human means you are wired for resilience, for connection, for renewal. Eddie's past was brutal, yes, but it wasn't the whole story, because beneath all that silence was a truth waiting to be remembered. That life, however fragile, however heavy, is still worth stepping back into. And maybe, just maybe, that reminder is what someone needs to hear right now.